Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Griffith. 5 minutes for your questions, please.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I did note with some interest just a minute ago, Mr. Guthrie mentioned that ZMAP's being grown in a tobacco plant. He said it wasn't the burley that he grows in his district. My district grows all kinds of tobacco, and if you all need more plants grown, I got a bunch of farmers who know how to grow tobacco and can do it very efficiently. That being said, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act requires FDA to finalize its guidance to industry regarding the development of animal models to support the approval, clearance, or licensure of countermeasures. Of course, clarifying how these products may be tested in animals is critical to developers, as human trials are rarely possible. In March of this year, FDA requested an additional 6 months to finalize this guidance. Dr. Borio, when do you expect this important guidance to be finalized?
It is very important to finalize this guidance. On the bright side, I have to say that the guidance has been well accepted by industry and academics. It's in circulation. We had a lot of consultation prior to putting this guidance together, and we are moving as if this guidance is final, but it's very important, I know, to finalize it. It is a priority for us.
All right, I appreciate that. Do you have any estimate of time, 6 months, a year?
I would like to finalize it as fast as I can.
Yes, ma'am. Appreciate that. Thank you. Dr. Fauci, I understand that several thousands of Ebola virus samples cannot be transported to NIH, CDC, and other government labs in the U.S. because the CDC, on behalf of the U.S. government, has not reached agreements with the countries of origin to permit the shipment and research of the samples. I would also note that on November 5th of this year, Reuters reported U.S. Ebola researchers plead for virus samples. I would have to assume that the NIH has a strong interest in getting these Ebola virus samples out of West Africa and over to NIH labs and other government labs. Am I correct in that?
Yes, it's important for us to get samples to be able to examine them and do the appropriate genomic sequencing. Right?
And that way you can have a better idea of whether or not it's mutating and how fast it's mutating. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And they also would be helpful in creating diagnostic tests. Is that correct?
Well, certainly you want to match the virus to the diagnostic test and vice versa.
And likewise, you want samples from as many of the countries affected as you can get, particularly Sierra Leone and Liberia, because they have or may have different strains. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not saying different strains. It could possibly be. When you say different strain, that's a big difference. The
right.
strain is the Ebola Zaire strain. There may be some slight modifications depending upon mutations, but it's not going to be a different strain.
Okay, and I use that's what happens when you're a country lawyer trying to mess with medical terms. But what you're after is to see if it's mutating and what's going
Correct.
on. Is that correct? And so
Correct.
If you only get it from one area, you may not be able to see all the mutations that are occurring. Is that accurate?
You're absolutely correct. You need a wide range of isolates from different places.
All right. And what is the biggest concern about mutations in the Ebola virus? And obviously I know that you know how much more contagious it is or how much more deadly it is, but what can you tell me about that as well as those obvious ones?
Yeah. From a practical standpoint, something that is feasible is that it could mutate and make the diagnostic tests a little bit less sensitive, or when you make a vaccine that would make a particular response against a virus, it may not be as avidly binding to the virus when you're looking for protection. There's always out there this issue, is it going to change so much that it dramatically changes its modality of transmission, namely what you've read about in the newspapers about becoming a respiratory-borne virus. Certainly that's not impossible, but that's a very, very unlikely scenario simply because in the history of viruses, it really would be unprecedented that a virus by mutation would completely change the method by which it's transmitted. So although we always look for that and keep it up as a possibility, it's unlikely. It's more likely that it would have some impact on the accuracy of the diagnostic test.
And let me ask about that, and it's probably too early for you to answer, but is that possibly one of the concerns with the doctor that was recently brought back to Nebraska, that originally the tests indicated he didn't have the disease, and then later it was clear that he did. He was symptomatic when they did the test, but he didn't test positive. Now, I understand. There are always errors and
Right.
mistakes and things happen, but is that one of the concerns that maybe?
It
it's
is,
enough?
but it is, sir, but I think it's something more likely because we've experienced this before. It is likely that it wasn't that there was anything wrong between the match between the test and the virus, but that when he got his first test, his level of virus was so low in his body that the test wasn't sensitive enough to pick it up. And when you wait a couple of days the way they did, they got a positive test, so there was no problem with the diagnostic test. It was likely that his level of virus was doing this and then started to go up. So when they did the first test, it might have been quite low, and then when they did it a few days later, it was high enough to pick up.
And how many days was it? Because I thought I had read somewhere that it may have been close to a week. It was 4 days.
4 days.
Okay.
Right.
All right. I see my time is up, and I appreciate your answers, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from North Carolina.